the 18th National Congress of China's Communist Party is open in Beijing. The week-long event will pick the next generation of Chinese leaders. What is the significance to Australia? What should we expect under the new leadership? Joining me to discuss and explore this issue and other issues of the day, the former Prime Minister and member for Griffith, Kevin Rudd in Brisbane. Mr. Rudd, thanks for your time. The Chinese President Xi Jinping, in his address at the opening of the Congress, has warned the top officials in the country that no one is above the law. How significant is that message, do you think, particularly off the back of the scandal around the disgraced politician Bo Xilai?
Well, I think what President Xi Jinping is pointing to, Kieran, is two things. A general concern about the future legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, which has been eaten away by corruption over time. And secondly, there's a quite specific message that you've just referred to, and that is a former member of the Politburo himself, Bo Xilai, appears about to be indicted on a series of charges. So I think it's got that double message, and it's a shot across the bows to the entire show.
That's the Bo Xilai scandal. Some analysts believe that the way it's been handled, rather than internally, the fact that it's gone through a more open process through the courts, that it might signal the Communist Party moving at least in some way towards embracing the rule of law. Do you share that optimism?
Well, China has to head in that direction for two sets of reasons. One, its own people are increasingly demanding that. And secondly, in terms of China's, shall I say, non-state economic actors, whether it's private companies within China itself or international corporates, for them to continue to have confidence in the system, you must have the beginnings of the independence of the legal system. So these are the two big push factors at the moment. China's been talking about a rule by law and not by men for the last 20 or 30 years. And there's been a fair bit of progress compared with when I was first sent to the country to work nearly 30 years ago. But if you're on a Richter scale of 1 to 10, maybe they've got to 0.4 on this one. It's still a ways to go.
Well, as the economy continues to grow, you alluded to it, I think, in that answer, but social justice and equity is an issue. Do you think that the Communist Party is sufficiently cognizant of that?
Very much so. If you're standing back from sort of the cut and thrust of day-to-day Chinese politics, where does the continued legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party in a one-party state continue to lie? One is continuing to deliver the economic goods, that is rising living standards, lifting people out of poverty and doing something for those who are actually not the direct beneficiaries of the reform and modernisation process. And the second pillar of legitimacy, since the death of ideology, the death of Marxism, is Chinese nationalism. We see both those things at play. And on the equity front, part of the economic pillar of legitimacy, they know that it's not just about creating an increasingly affluent Chinese middle class of some hundreds of millions of people. It's about those who have yet to be lifted out of poverty at all, particularly in the western part of the country.
In terms of that nationalism point that you referred to, we're seeing this, well, it's once in a decade transition in China. Would you expect any major foreign policy shift under Xi Jinping and the Premier Li Keqiang from the Hu Jintao era? Should we anticipate a more assertive China, for example?
If we look at the personalities likely to make up the Standing Committee of the Politburo, this is going to be, I think, could be wrong, a 7-member body. The previous one is 9. It's the closest China comes to the equivalent of our cabinet system of government. The composition of this body, the Standing Committee, I think is likely to be solidly reformist. But reformist in this sense, number one challenge is the further reform of the economy. The current Chinese growth model is running out of juice. They know that, they recognise that, it's in their most recent 5-year plan, but they've got to implement a new growth model which will be painful, and it involves a larger role for the Chinese private sector and for domestic consumption. That's where the big emphasis is going to be to start with. Secondly, given that is the emphasis for the next 5 years, they're going to want to maintain strategic stability in East Asia. And this is where you have, obviously, some tensions, because maintaining China's claim in terms of its territorial claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea on the one hand against other countries in the region on the other, and maintaining broad strategic stability is going to be a real challenge. But that, I believe, is the core agenda where we ourselves as Australia in the region, together with the United States and other friends and partners, need to work with the Chinese in developing a rules-based order for security in East Asia to prevent conflict by miscalculation in particular.
President Obama, on to another bit related issue. He secured a second term, obviously in the United States. You'd welcome that. And does the stability in the White House, in your view, make you more optimistic about relations with China, but not just China, other international problems that remain unresolved?
Well, personally, I'm delighted to see Barack Obama return to the White House. He's a good guy. And he knows Australia, he likes Australia, and Australians like him. But on the core questions of policy, in terms of our own interests, remember he's presided over the rebalance of US force posture to ensure that a globally shrinking US military force still maintains its current deployment strength in Asia and the Pacific. And secondly, this is very important, the US has joined regional diplomatic institutions, namely the East Asian Summit, with a lot of support from us, to get them round the table with the Chinese to begin to carve out a rules-based security order for Asia to prevent conflict and war by accident. So I think with his re-election, he knows China. There won't be a learning curve because he's been at it for the last 4 years. With Xi Jinping coming in, who's spent a fair bit of time in the United States and with the Americans over the last 5 years, there is now a good opportunity to embark upon what I've described elsewhere as a new strategic roadmap for US-China relations for the next 5 years. And across the world, I think that should be to our advantage as well.
Beyond the avoiding the fiscal cliff, as it's described, what do you see looming as the major challenges for President Obama's second term in office?
Well, if you take the long view of the global financial crisis and where it's taken us all over the last 5 years, we've come from a time when, as you know, we in Australia had to decisively intervene through fiscal stimulus to prevent this economy from rolling across our own cliff way back then. And we've done so successfully. And we've one of the few countries in the world, developed countries, not to be plunged into recession or mass unemployment. Now, of course, the consequence of this global recession across the rest of the world has been that countries like the United States have found themselves in all sorts of difficulty. And the US, given the nature of their Congress, finds itself in now an impasse about tax cuts, about tax increases, and about what to do on the expenditure side as well. If they don't fix this at a political level, you're going to see a massive knock-on effect, as you know, to US GDP, perhaps in the order of 5% of US GDP, plunging their economy into recession with huge implications for the rest of us, which is why I believe common sense will prevail.
And finally, you've boosted your profile recently in the media. Far be it for me to be critical of that. We encourage people politicians and senior politicians like yourself appearing on television shows and radio and so on. So good on you for that. There should be more of it. But should we read anything into the fact that you're lifting your profile recently?
Other than you guys being a little bit underemployed, no, nothing at all. Kieran, how many times has this program asked me on in the last month, do you reckon?
No,
7, 8, 9, 10
no, exactly.
Times, and this is the only one I've accepted. And I accept maybe about 10% of the media invitations that I receive to speak out. And the reason I choose to speak out on days like this is because I'm passionate about our future relationship with China and China's future relationship with the United States. This is one of the 4 or 5 big challenges for us for the next 10 years. And I think there's a role for us in the middle of this, and I'll continue to advocate for that. And for other areas where I've got some passionate views about the country's future or about my own community's future here in the southern suburbs of Brisbane.
You'll be undertaking a regular spot with Neil Mitchell on 3AW. He cheekily compared it to the fireside chats of one of your predecessors who famously returned for a successful second stint at the top job. Is that how it should be seen, do you think?
Yeah, right, Kieran. Yeah, I don't think I've got Bob Menzies' either ideology or eyebrows. That's how I'd answer that question. But look, as I said, whenever the invitations come up, I'll evaluate them. And if I've got something I believe is useful to say on international questions, on China, on climate change, as well as the global financial crisis, where I've done a bit over the years and still have, I think, a contribution to make in the policy debate, but on national questions like reconciliation and closing the gap with Indigenous people, and the local stuff where, frankly, here in Queensland, my community suffers hugely from the impact of the Liberal National Party's government decide to slash and burn basic public services. These things, you're going to hear my voice up there as often as I judge it to be useful. And so don't read into it, mate, and I'm not about to grow bushy eyebrows.
Thanks very much, and thanks for accepting this. One of, as you say, dozens of requests. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kieran.